One of the things that has been about the success or the improved gains of National Conservative and Populist Party is the people. From farmer protests with people in Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, Poland, they're sort of going out to police the borders because the state won't do it. In my own country, you've got the flagging phenomenon. And more parents and grandparents looking into what their children are being taught about LGBTQ in schools. So the fact that people are finding their voice, the fact that people are being brave enough to speak out, I think is really important.
The Democracy Shield contains lots of stuff about the role that they're going to play in kind of safeguarding elections. They have all these euphemisms: safeguarding, protecting, supporting, independence. They have all these euphemisms, which basically mean making sure it goes in one direction.
If you neglect your defenses, chances are that you're not going to be taken serious in defense matters.
The biggest threats to Europe are not external, but from within. Europe doesn't know what it stands for. It doesn't know what it would fight for. It doesn't believe in itself. Over 1.5 billion spent on the SERV programme to fund NGOs, fund different projects that are all promoting the EU's own agenda. I mean, the complete audacity of it. And no shame whatsoever. So you look at some of these things and you know that most people would be shocked and horrified to know that these things are being funded.
Let alone to be funded by the EU.
Let alone to be funded by the EU.
So hello and Merry Christmas from the MCC Brussels podcast. And we've had a wonderful year, jam-packed with lots of stuff, loads of reports that we've told you a lot about, and some great content on our YouTube channel. In this special Christmas edition of the MCC Brussels podcast, we want to take stock, reflect on what's been a very intellectually and politically exciting year, and try and consider some of the major topics and stories from the year. So to look back on the year, I'm delighted to be joined by Pieter Cleppe, who's been a regular guest on our podcast this year. He's been very reliable in supplying useful insight across the whole year. So Pieter, welcome.
Thank you, Jacob.
And as a special Christmas treat, someone who doesn't often come on the podcast, our Chief of Staff, Tony Gilland. Welcome.
Delighted to be here, Jacob. Merry Christmas.
Yeah, Merry Christmas indeed. So this week on the podcast, rather than trying to name every political story that's happened across the year, we want to grab things by a few themes. So we're going to look at the year, as you might call it, of populist advances, but also a year of retrenchment of attempts at control by EU elites. We're going to take another theme of rivalry or increasing contest between the USA and Europe, or more precisely the EU. We're also going to have a little look at some important culture stories about the culture war that never goes away. And we're also going to take a look at EU scandals and the work that we and others have been doing to lift the lid on the murky world of EU politics, including the very famous NGO scandals. So firstly, because it's Christmas, we're in a celebratory mood. I wanted to celebrate a year which has been an exciting one if you, like us, support the right-wing, conservative, populist moment and movement in European politics. Now, there haven't been hundreds of elections, loads of really big elections. There's been a couple of important ones in Poland, Czechia, elsewhere. But more than anything, it seems like there's been a mood of a kind of growing surge, a sense that things are slowly and irreversibly maybe turning in the direction of populist parties, especially in some of the big countries that are expecting to have elections next year. But Pieter, what's been your take on this year from a kind of conservative or patriotic or populist perspective?
Well, first of all, I'm not too happy with the term populist. I know that many people use it, and that's fair enough. A term always, is dependent on what you mean with it. But I actually do think that a lot of populism is to be found among our ruling elites. If you're talking about energy policy, they sort of embarked on large-scale experiments. Many experts disagree with it, but they went ahead with it anyway, and now we're paying the price for it. Same with sort of car manufacturing or populist establishment politicians claimed to know what markets would prefer in the future. They claimed it was electric vehicles. That turned out to be wrong. And indeed, to answer your question, for example, in the Czech Republic, we have a government that is far from perfect, but that indeed can be described as anti-establishment in the sense that they disagree with the march of ever greater centralization in the European Union. And I firmly believe that is definitely one of the reasons why the Czech electorate has voted for them. As you said, there were not many important elections, but in the opinion polls, we saw the same sentiment being expressed across Europe. Even outside of the EU, we saw the rise of Nigel Farage and Reform UK. In Germany, we saw that AfD went from about 20 to 27%, if I'm not mistaken, in the opinion polls, just when actually Friedrich Merz, supposed to be a pretty sensible conservative, went to power. Now, what did Merz do? He broke pretty much all of his promises on migration, on the Schwarze Null, as they call it, a responsible budgetary policy. He threw it all out the window. He cooperated with the Greens after the election, before there was a new German parliament, just to rush through a massive spending package, completely going against his election promises. And again, the AfD is far from a perfect party, to put it mildly. There's some decent people, but some, I would say, less than decent people there as well. But I do think the German electorate is sort of desperate, and they're looking for a way to send a signal that they absolutely disagree with it. And I do think you see the same pattern across Europe, except in countries where the establishment, like in Italy, is not going along as much with some of the centralization. Yeah, they're going along to a degree, but they're clearly a break on it.
Yeah. Well, then, and that last thing you said, I wanted to get your thoughts on, Tony, because one theme, if you like, of the year is this growing sense of dissatisfaction, even if it hasn't found yet entirely ways to express itself.
Yeah, well, actually, I mean, given it's Christmas, some healthy debate around the Christmas table was probably no bad thing. And so in that respect, I think, disagree to some extent with you, Pieter, on your take on populism. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we can't just go rah-rah, the populists, and it doesn't matter what the policies are. But the reality is, for me, that one of the things that has been about the success or the improved gains of National Conservative and Populist Party is the people. From farmer protests, and we're likely to have some more of those in Brussels tomorrow, I believe, with the Mercosur deal, with people in Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, Poland, sort of going out to police the borders because the state won't do it. In my own country, you've got the flagging phenomenon, with the flags going up everywhere. People want to celebrate their Britishness, for example. And more parents and grandparents looking into what their children are being taught about LGBTQ in schools. So the fact that people are finding their voice, the fact that people are being brave enough to speak out, I think is really important. I think it's the duty of National Conservative and Populist parties to connect with that. It doesn't mean you just run with it, but you've got to find that connection with people to have further electoral success. And that's where, in terms of the polling results you're talking about for AfD, they're replicated for our RN, even more so in relation to the presidential election. And I think that's an exciting phenomenon. And I think it's already resulting in pressure being put on the centrist parties and the EU elite, which we're seeing in the European Parliament through new, sort of voting alliances that are taking place on a pragmatic basis. And maybe that's something you want to look at, Jacob.
Yeah, well, actually, a good one for Pieter, because it seems that, you talked about Merz, but elsewhere there's this sense, especially in Brussels and in the European Parliament in Brussels and Strasbourg, but there's a sense that the elite are increasingly under pressure, are kind of having to find little gifts, as it were, to kind of give out sort of a little bit of rowing back on, for example, environmental policies here, a few tough words on migration. Do you think that this establishment feel a lot more under threat than they have in recent years?
Well, absolutely. That's undeniable indeed. As you mentioned, the omnibus regulation or sort of package, which is a policy package of watering down moderately some of the worst excesses of the green policies that were rushed through during the first term of Ursula von der Leyen. The fact that this was passed in the European Parliament against the left, supported by the centrist European People's Party, the centre-right, the right, the populist, maybe if you want to. I do think that's very welcome, and it's also great because it does reflect exactly what we see in opinion polls of what people think of some of these central planning, never-ending bans and restrictions. You can't install gas heating in your house, for example, on very shaky environmental grounds. There's nothing wrong with genuine environmental concerns, but I did think we can all distinguish between sort of the environmentalism that is effectively only repackaged socialism and genuine environmentalism.
But I guess you've had this situation where, going back to something you said earlier, the reality is that mainstream politicians have hid behind scientific expertise on these questions for so long. So we got ourselves into this mess by allowing politicians to say, the science tells us we must do net zero. The science tells us we're in impending doom and we must do net zero. And actually people are going, no, that's not what, that doesn't add up. That's not what the science is telling us. And actually it's up to, people are saying, we want to drive our cars. It's Christmas. We got to go visit our families. We don't want to be forced into electric vehicles by 2035. And so, again, I think it is that pressure coming from the electorate as well as the lead that some national conservative and populist parties are taking that is allowing some shift. And where I do agree with you is that the rollback is currently limited and therefore keeping up the pressure is of absolutely vital importance for 2026.
Yeah, and just briefly on that, I mean, what do we think we can expect from National Conservative? Pieter doesn't like populists. We won't invite him back on the podcast again. But what do we think 2026 holds? I don't just mean in terms of elections, but you might want to touch that. What do you think next year is going to hold for these kind of anti-establishment forces?
Well, take a look at Germany. There's lots of state elections in Germany. I think, I may be wrong, but I think Merz, if he continues this course, his party will suffer an absolute hammering. And it's not just Merz, also the minister-president of North Rhine-Westphalia, which is the biggest German state in terms of population. Only a few weeks ago, he said he was hoping that his state was going to be the first state in Europe that would reach net zero. I mean, you're wondering, okay, it's 2025, hasn't he read the news or something? So the Germans always like to stick to the plan. There's not really a lot of flexibility there. Certainly not in Western Germany, where the CDU is still very close to Angela Merkel and everything that she stood for, denying that mass migration brings a number of challenges. For example, large-scale experimentation with the energy supply. What could possibly go wrong? Ever more concentration of money and power at the Brussels level, massive transfers for the Eurozone crisis, sort of the whole Merkel legacy that is still intellectually supported by parts of the party of Friedrich Merz. And apparently he does not seem to have a backbone to go against that. So to go back to your question, take a look at Germany. Is Friedrich Merz going to survive politically until the end of 26? I don't dare to say that's going to happen.
Yeah. Tony, what do you expect?
Well, I think given we're talking about elections, we can't not reference one of the big elections that's coming up, which is the election in Hungary, national election in Hungary in April. That's going to be massive. We know that the European Union is looking for regime change, and maybe that's something we're going to move on to talk about in terms of election interference by the EU. But I think we really are going to be looking at what happens in Hungary in very close detail. And it is the case that Hungary has been one of the countries that's been prepared to go against the European Union diktat, particularly on migration policy, where it's being fined €1 million a day for securing its borders. An absolutely bizarre situation to be fined €1 million a day for actually doing what everyone now wants to achieve, which is secure borders.
Yeah, well, let's move on then, because the next kind of big theme of stuff I wanted to bring together for the for our review is the kind of counterpart, the dark counterpart to the success of anti-establishment national conservative forces is an increasing retrenchment and an attempt to expand the powers available to the EU elite, to police discourse, to interfere in elections, and all the powers that they're seeking to hold themselves, and centralize power in a number of ways, even things that look kind of like concessions to the populist movement, like the Migration Pact, actually represent an enormous centralization of power in Brussels. So I wanted to get both of your thoughts on this topic as well. And Tony, we've seen, especially the launch, the beginning of the rollout of the Democracy Shield, which we've done a lot of work on. It is the dynamic quite straightforward. The more pressure they get put under in elections, the more they seek to clamp down on speech.
Well, if anyone hasn't read it yet, it's only recently come out. Norman Lewis is our research fellows. A Shield Against Democracy is the name of his report, and it's absolutely fantastic, well worth reading. So, talking about free speech, well, I looked up, because it is Christmas and we're getting towards the new year. Merriam-Webster word of the year for 2025 was slop. That's low-quality content generated by AI. I think we should be ready for 2026, popularizing and ridiculing and pulling apart another concept called pre-bunking. So pre-bunking is one of my favorite words in this report. And what Dr. Lewis's report does is says this is basically proactive censorship. So they're using an AI model. This is work being funded by Google, an AI model along with NGO fact checkers to basically preempt things becoming a controversy, preempt difficult narratives coming out.
Pre-crime.
It's a pre-crime. It's a pre-crime. So they're pre-bunking. And I think it's our duty in 2026 to debunk pre-bunking.
The respect is interesting. You mentioned the Democracy Shield. So the logo of the Stasi, which was the vile East German secret service, was sort of a shield. It was like the shield of the party, the shield of the state, to protect the people against themselves.
Yeah. People really should check out what they're planning. And I mean, it builds on stuff that already exists that we've talked about before on the podcast, the Digital Services Act and other things that Pieter has actually talked about in some detail before. So there's enormous attempts at clamping down on speech. Anyone who watches our podcast will be bored of us saying how outrageous it is. So maybe to move on just a tiny bit, Pieter, it's also been a year of, as it were, election interference. I mean, the classic case was the year before, in the case of the Romanian elections, but they've been trying this with elections in Moldova as well, and also intensifying news about, say, clamping down on Marine Le Pen or even banning the FD. Is this a sign of things to come?
I thought the Le Pen case was very worrying. Basically, what she is doing should probably be prosecuted. It looks illegal to me as far as I've been reading it. But then to sort of, stop her from, running an election, that is quite something. Basically what she is doing is common practice in Belgian politics. Political parties using people that are paid by the taxpayer to work for parliaments, political parties basically using the staff to work for them. That's common practice. And again, you can fine it, you can prosecute it, fine, but to sort of on that basis stop somebody from running an election. Whereas I'm pretty sure you can find examples in France. I remember the example of François Bayrou, the other prime minister, the former prime minister, who sort of got into hot water for similar stuff. There look to be a lot of double standards involved. I mean, she is, hate her or love her, she is the great rival for the current establishment in France. And I'm surprised that there is not more opposition to it. Maybe it's some internal national rally thing that some rivals of Le Pen actually don't really mind all that much. I'm just speculating. I have no idea. But whatever you think of her, I think this is completely unacceptable what happened. And yeah, like you see indeed, as you mentioned, attempts by the same people that always talk about democracy, etc. Yeah, to fall for, to fall for the temptation to use certain powers to not play it straight, to sort of try to intervene. And indeed, the Romanian election, I think, was an example of that as well.
Yeah, but absolutely on Le Pen. I mean, what's really striking there again is they will not allow the people to decide. So as you say, there's this question over the systematic use of EU funds, if that was the case, to support political work in the home country. It seems like a very fuzzy area, and as you say, lots and lots of people are at it. But the people can work that out for themselves. They could take that into account when they vote. And the one thing they don't want to do is allow the people to decide on a candidate. Just like with Georgescu in Romania, they don't want to allow the people to choose a candidate that is going to go in a completely different direction. Though, funnily enough, in this situation with Bardella, the reality is he's actually polling above Le Pen at the moment. So goodness knows what they're going to try and do to take Bardella down. We'll have to watch out for that in 2026. But it's the last thing they want to do. Meanwhile, you talk about the use of taxpayer money. Taxpayer money being used to fund the NGOs to promote a pro-federalist, pro-EU perspective and fund the NGOs to be these trusted flaggers that then, through the DSA and now the Democracy Shield, to control the narrative in the future election campaign. So it's a rather hypocritical challenge that you've got here, where it's all about protecting taxpayers' money, where they're freely using taxpayers' money to promote their own agenda.
Yeah, I think it's become quite interesting in the last few months, especially the degree to which elections have become such a kind of contested concept in the EU vocabulary, as it were. So we now they've been holding big conferences in Parliament, in the European Parliament, talking about how to strengthen elections. The Democracy Shield contains lots of stuff about the role that they're going to play in kind of safeguarding elections. They have all these euphemisms: safeguarding, protecting, supporting, independence. They have all these euphemisms, which basically mean making sure it goes in one direction. And it shows that as strong as their policing of speech is, Pieter, they're actually also going a step further now and looking to contest directly the results of elections.
Yeah, I think there's some examples indeed of that. Now, I do think I'm mostly worried by the speech restrictions and the fact that they go after big tech and they give a massive fine on Twitter. For Twitter X, they impose a fine because of one of the reasons was the verification is not really verification, that is misleading. So it's only normal that we give 140 million or something fine for a private company where people voluntarily sign up to. They know that the blue dot or the green dot doesn't actually mean what it purports to mean. You can just pay and get one,
which at least people now know. That's how you you could just.
I mean, but
Christmas gift.
I think it shows that the European Commission is completely out of control, and I'm not so sure what the solution is, because I would scrap parts of the EU treaty, but I think large parts of it are fine. I think it's actually the actual people in that particular institution. And maybe we should just fire them all and only rehire the people that commit to be loyal servants of the member states. I mean, just one wild suggestion. I'm sure there's many others. But I do think we have to try to think, okay, like if we want to change this, if we want to refound the EU, whatever you call it, like how should it look like? How do we sort of, make sure that we don't repeat the same mistakes? Because I think the people that are currently in charge in the European Commission, it looks hopeless to me.
Yeah. And that, Tony, and that fine on X, although it was very recent and is fresh in our minds, was really the kind of key example of this. Like, none of it made sense from any perspective, the charges that they'd leveled against X, and yet the reason they went after X.
Absolutely. But I mean, that's what the Digital Services Act is all about. So, it's about drawing a line in the sand and saying, if you don't comply with our narrative, if you challenge us on certain key issues, we are going to take you down. So they needed, in a way, to make an example of somebody, and X was the obvious candidate. It may well be, and we might come on to this shortly when we talk about relationships with America, that they've actually misplayed their hand, because one thing that is rightly really aggravating America, both about the EU and the UK also, is the Digital Services Act and the equivalent in the UK, which is completely anti-free speech. And this is, so maybe not treaty change first step. We could talk about this as a big picture, but actually basically repealing the Digital Services Act would be a very, very good first step. And that's where we need more debate and discussion on the right, because there are many on the right who I think have been a little bit taken in by the discussion around online safety, and online safety in particular for children. And obviously that's a very, we all really want to prioritize the safety of children, but they've got a little bit trapped into thinking that this is the way to do it. And in fact, the reality is we know that the primary motive of the DSA is nothing to do with online safety. It's all about controlling the narrative.
Yeah, well, to move on then in the direction you suggest, Tony, it's been a kind of landmark year in EU-US relations, driven obviously by the election of Trump. And it's interesting thinking back on this, because I remember when Trump was elected, and I and lots of other people commented that there was less kind of overt Trump derangement syndrome around. You didn't see people weeping in Brussels like you might have done the first time he was elected. Yet instead, as the year's gone on, there's been a kind of slow burn, and instead there's been an attempt to almost develop a more, what they think of as a more mature, but nonetheless more forthright response to Trumpism, to position America and Europe as kind of genuine competitors and rivals. I wonder what you make of this, Pieter. There's lots of examples we can touch on, the X-Fine being one of them, but this has been a year where this kind of rivalry, especially between the EU elite and Trumpism, has kind of come into focus.
And especially in defense, I think you see that. Even, again, Friedrich Merz, the German chancellor, he has been making some remarks suggesting that the US is drifting away from Europe. And to be fair, the Trump administration deserves some blame for that. I don't think they're actually keen to drift away. On the contrary, what they want is their allies to step up their game and to do their part in the defense alliance, which is, I think, only fair. And Trump being Trump, and he does that in his own way, which is, I would say, a bit more firm than former American presidents. And therefore, this can be abused by anti-American or by people that share anti-American sentiment in Europe for, campaigning for breaking away from the U.S. Indeed, I think we in the defense realm, we notice that there's some movement, at least in the debate. In reality, obviously, European countries remain very dependent on the United States. So I'm actually not so negative. I think in the long term, I think Trump plan is working out. European nations are rearming, which is a good thing. You need an army. Of course, you shouldn't push it too far. Also, the Belgian Prime Minister was making a joke that, okay, do we actually want Germany to rearm again? They invaded twice the last 100 years. So yeah, but ultimately, I think it's going to work out, because also we have a shared culture between America and Europe.
Yeah, and I mean, that was one of the focuses, something we talked about before on this podcast, the national security strategy, and the American concern that shared culture maybe doesn't exist to the degree it once did in Europe. But Tony, your broad thoughts on this kind of year where, say, this rival, or at least an attempt to make a rivalry, is going to really come into play.
Well, I think I would first just go back to the J.D. Vance's Munich speech, because when you talk about rearmament, he made this key point that the biggest threats to Europe are not external, but from within. And if you look at all of the surveys on, particularly in Western Europe, I mean, it's fascinating. If you look from going from Eastern Europe across Western Europe, who's prepared to fight for their country? And the numbers are shockingly low. And it's not surprising, because as Vance pointed out, Europe doesn't know what it stands for. It doesn't know what it would fight for. It doesn't believe in itself. And then that's reiterated in the national security strategy. So I think there is a strong sense of America, if you like, holding up a mirror to Europe and saying, look at yourself, look at the state you've got yourself in, and talk about civilizational erasure, which has been the phrase of this last few weeks, everyone talking about the statement within the national security strategy. I mean, that's a very, very real question. So you could say, America's acting like a friendly critic. At the same time, there does seem to be some quite important rivalries, particularly around, it's not so much just trade, but the approaches to trade. So Europe has prided itself on being the regulator, and it goes around telling the rest of the world, telling South America, telling Africa, if you want to trade with us, you've got to sign up to net zero, you've got to sign up to LGBTQI and all the rest of it. And that position of dominance in terms of regulation that Europe's had by having the biggest single market has been challenged. And that's where I think there is a genuine rivalry. It's a rivalry over values, and America is saying no. And that's exactly what's also happening with the online Free Speech and Digital Service Act. America is saying no. And when it comes to the trade deals, if you go back to the meeting of von der Leyen with Trump at his golf course in Scotland back in the summer, what can you say? I mean, von der Leyen had nothing to say. And who knows how it will pan out in the end. But the reality is Europe is looking extremely weak on the global stage and increasingly irrelevant.
Yeah, well, one place where that's pretty obvious, Pieter, is obviously in relation to discussions around Ukraine. You've got this enormous ongoing war on the doorstep of European countries and in Europe, and yet nobody even pretends to take seriously the concerns or wishes, not just of the EU, but of any of the European nation states.
Yeah, I mean, if you neglect your defenses, chances are that you're not going to be taken serious in defense matters, and you can't just overturn this in a few years. This is a work of 10, 15 years at least. Now, at the moment, we have this big discussion on how to continue to help Ukraine. And I think there's a lot of sort of unwillingness to look at the facts. And the facts are that military support and financial support to Ukraine did help the country to defend themselves. Of course, when we engage into this, we should not end up in a direct conflict with Russia. So far, so good. I think we should also not undermine our rule of law by confiscating Russian assets. There's all kinds of other ways to finance Ukraine, for example, paying for it directly. But that is a method that has helped to finance Ukraine in a careful way, not giving them all the weapons, because some weapons may be seen as too offensive, a very unclear definition, I know, but so far we didn't, or the West, so to speak, didn't really get it that much wrong, I think. Where we got it absolutely wrong, I think, is on the sanctions. The sanctions have absolutely not helped Ukraine. This is a case of a politician wanting to do something, and then this is something. So therefore, that is what the politician is doing. They're now even thinking to expand the sanctions on Russian fertilizer, for example. And this is an interesting case because what happened is because Europe started buying less gas from Russia, you need a lot of gas to make fertilizer. Europe became more dependent on Russian fertilizer production. As a result, it's getting very difficult now to impose sanctions on that, because this would badly harm our farming sector that is already completely under siege from all kinds of green madness. So despite all that, they still want to continue with the sanctions. We still have 15% of our LNG coming from Russia. No, that all has to go. And nobody asks, okay, why don't we just only continue with the instrument that has been helping Ukraine, and that we stop with the instrument sanctions that has not been of any help whatsoever to Ukraine, has on the contrary strengthened the Russian regime, just like the sanctions in the day helped Saddam Hussein, or why they have been helping the Iranian regime, the Cuban regime, and Venezuela. Yeah, we always continue with the same mistake, and we expect different results.
Yeah, that appearance of geopolitical cluelessness has really defined the European approach vis-a-vis Ukraine, and why they just look kind of shut out as peace negotiations seem to get more and more serious, Tony.
Yeah, well, you've got a mixture of things. You've got a very divided Europe. So we have a European High Representative, which itself is a really odd concept when you've got so many different national interests. And I think that in some ways this comes back to the national security strategy. It's pointing out the technocratic supranational approach of the European Union does not work. So we really have to get back to national interest and collaboration. You could have a much stronger, if you like, European, not a common foreign policy, but a much stronger geopolitical influence if we got back to national sovereignty and countries working together and negotiating their collaboration and what positions they're prepared to adopt in common. And at the moment, you've got the worst of both worlds. You've got this pretense at a common approach from the European High Representative, then being contradicted by the European Council. And then when it comes to the decisions that individual nations are prepared to make, not really being on the same page at all. Then we hear about the coalition of the willing, which actually...
The unwilling, yeah.
Is actually, the coalition of the feeble, the coalition of the utterly feeble and adrift.
Yeah. And I mean, nowhere has this been more obvious, and we discussed it in the podcast, than the attempt to, as Pieter points out, to confiscate the Russian assets. You have a country like Belgium, been very supportive of Ukraine, and yet and then an attempt by the centre and threats of using majority voting to undermine them, which is only going to kind of further fray what remains of public support for Ukraine. So, yeah, there's...
Again, Friedrich Merz, I should point out, who changed the German position on this and left it to Belgium, poor little Belgium, to stand up for some sanity. And thankfully, Italy is now supporting Belgium on this.
Yeah, the Belgians may well be proved right in this one in the longer run, I think. Right, coming on to another thing, we could actually have this theme, I think, every single year, because every year you watch the European Union and European elites, you're going to find scandals and loads of them. So we wanted to pack together a few of them. I mean, for us at MCC Brussels, this has been the year of unmasking the NGO industrial complex, of digging into how the funding, European central funding through the Commission and various arm's length bodies is used to sustain the NGO industry. But there's been lots more that you could choose on, pick on. But Tony, what's been one of your kind of key things that's unearthed scandals for you this year?
Well, I was genuinely shocked, to be honest, at things uncovered by our research fellows. So Thomas Fazzi, his first report looking at the propaganda complex, over 1.5 billion spent on the SERVE program to fund NGOs, fund different projects that are all promoting the EU's own agenda. I mean, the level of it surprised me. But then to have Ashley Frawley follow up with her report looking at the funding of trans activists and the funding of the LGBTQ NGOs to really push the gender agenda and to promote things like the parental certificate across the European Union, to promote these educational initiatives in schools for young people. I mean, the complete audacity of it. And no shame whatsoever. So you look at some of these things and you know that most people would be shocked and horrified to know that these things are being funded. And it's
let alone to be funded by the EU.
Let alone to be funded by the EU. And yet they do it quite blazonly, either because they don't care or because they're just so arrogant that they think that everybody else would nod along with these awful programs. So I have to say I was delighted with the research done. I was genuinely shocked at how bad it was.
Yeah, lots to choose from this year, Pieter. We've had more revelations on Pfizergate, College of Europe scandal breaking receipt. What has caught your eye?
Well, of course, the College of Europe scandal was quite something. Federica Mogherini taken in by Belgian police. As a result, the Belgian justice and police services were being criticized by some Euro bubble characters. They didn't really like that. Now, it does look quite serious. Mogherini has stepped down. Of course, she is innocent until proven guilty. As far as I understand, it concerns some kind of a rigged tender for the European Diplomatic Academy. Surprise, surprise. It's very, let's say, much the socialist family. Again, I'm not saying that politicians from other persuasions cannot be corrupt, but that was also the case, of course, in Qatargate, which is ongoing, where the Belgian justice does deserve some criticism. Especially the police services seem to have coordinated with the media. They already seem to know the precise figures of the amounts that were found in the houses of these people. But yeah, it's not a good look. And to be honest, it's exactly what what I would expect to come out of the EU institutions, because
there's a kind of chummy atmosphere, isn't
we
there?
have enormous budgets with people able to work in the shadows, very little media scrutiny, very little checks and balances. So I think that's the most important lesson. It's one thing to say, oh, this person or this person is corrupt or evil. Yeah, you have good people everywhere, also, of course, in the EU institutions. But when the incentives are wrong, then this is what you get, basically.
You say chummy atmosphere, and I agree with you, but you also have an incredible arrogance. And I mean, that for me was just brought out by the Pfizergate. You had the EU General Court in May annulling the European Commission's decision to not respond to the Freedom of Information request, and still zero is known about the content of those texts. Absolutely zero. And to date, the European Commission seems to have just not batted an eyelid, kept a straight face, and move on. Nothing to see here.
And they want to read our text, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. And then another element of this refers to the brazenness of what you were talking about earlier, Tony, is, I mean, and then again, to reference a report we did on the professors of propaganda, as we called it, the Jean Monnet fellowships and the associated funding around that. It was really notable because a lot of these exposés that we and other organizations have done have really gone viral on especially on X. Another reason why they want to clamp down on it. But the signal thing that caught my eye was the Polish Foreign Minister Sikorski responding to somebody quoting our report on the Jean Monnet professors on how they're funded by the EU to promote EU values. And his response was, well, why wouldn't we do this? They have no sense that there's something called academia where people are supposed to be independent and have that they just like, why wouldn't we? That we exist to the EU values, we have to push it all the way.
Yeah, world of their own.
Yeah, absolutely. Same in Brussels. Many people don't get what the actual problem is of European Commission bureaucrats sort of hiring their own little civil society or fake civil society to promote XYZ. In some cases, I remember this report from Die Welt. Some of these groups were legally campaigning against the Mercosur trade deal, while the other arm of the European Commission was frantically trying to get this trade deal over the line. So yeah, I mean, if that doesn't show that the institution of the European Commission is in dire need of reform, then what does?
Completely sorry, I just repeat myself, they're completely in their own bubble. And that lack of connection with the electorate, it just speaks volumes. And I mean, and that's the whole point. That America's pointing out to us, you've got unelected president. An unelected president. Now, the danger is...
I don't want an elected...
Exactly, the danger is people want an elected president, but...
Well, she should be a bureaucrat.
She should be a bureaucrat and a secretary with the EU Council fully in control. And maybe it's time to look at whether the European Parliament is playing a good role or not.
Yeah, 100%. Right, to end, I wanted to take a few things. We're big believers, MCC Brussels, that fighting the culture war is a really important part of addressing some of these civilizational challenges that have been pointing out, that winning the argument on matters that to some people seem marginal about transgender ideology or the role of gender or what we teach children. But these are fundamental issues for us. We wanted to reflect a little bit on what's happened this year, because on the one hand, we've seen a retrenchment of a lot of these issues. There's been increasing use the courts to bypass national sovereign decisions on these issues, but also a lot of stuff's come to light, which has been really important for us. So we've had a series of reports looking at the role of gender identity and the funding of gender ideology, as Tony mentioned earlier. But Pieter, this has also been a big year for a whole range of kind of cultural issues. What stood out for you this year?
Well, we had the Bondi Beach attack in Sydney, and I think it's very difficult to dissociate this from the Gaza protests all across the world. Now, we all know that the Gaza protests are barely about Gaza. So whatever you think about this, of course, the state of Israel, like any state, like any government, especially in war, makes many decisions, and it's totally fair to challenge this, right? And it's, of course, good that people care for the plight of the Palestinians. But to single out a single conflict and sort of hysterically organized protests about this sort of suggests that there may be another reason. So I see these protests more as anti-Western rallies. And it's no surprise that also many Westerners from a leftist persuasion are to be found there. And some people genuinely criticize the Netanyahu government because they think, rightly or wrongly, that Netanyahu is completely mishandling this there. But many others go a lot further. We had issues in Belgium of a bakery in Ghent, a Jewish bakery, a secular Jewish bakery, having to close down because of the intimidation. I find this all very worrying, and it's no surprise to then see actual attacks like in Sydney. In Antwerp, we have a Jewish community that is very visual because they are Orthodox Jews, and these people are afraid. I think rightly so. And I think it would be one thing if, we wouldn't see the kind of people that are stirring up all these hatreds, but we do see it. They are shouting and screaming often in languages from the Middle East, not languages from Europe, on the streets of Europe. They disrespect, at least in Brussels, orders from the authorities when the authorities tell them to protest on a certain time at a certain place. We actually know what the troublemakers are now. I'm against bans on hate speech, and I will also defend these people's rights to spread hatred as long as it's not incitement to violence. But often they do breach the line of incitement to violence, and then I think the authorities must act very, very hard.
Yeah,
because otherwise we're going to have more instances like.
Yeah, but there's also just a clear reluctance to challenge what goes on, even if like in the natural to and fro of things, the protesters might overstep the line a bit, the police might overstep the lines a bit in normal society. But it seems there's a real kind of reluctance to both at the official level and unofficially, Tony, to challenge some of this.
Well, I think we have to be really careful to call things what they are. So you mentioned the attack on Bondi Beach. It's not an attack; it's a pogrom, straightforward pogrom. And what we've seen, so things have got very, very dangerous. We've got the attack on the Manchester synagogue. We had the firebombs in Colorado. We had the Berlin Holocaust Memorial stabbing consistently. So basically what we're seeing is Jews have been made fair game again. That's what we're seeing. We've got to call out this dark note. And the reality is it's like you've got countries rushing to recognize a Palestinian statehood and doing nothing to challenge this call for a global intifada. So you're absolutely correct about these massive protests taking place in favor of Palestine across Europe in big cities, and they call for a global intifada, and it doesn't get called out. It doesn't get called out. And it really is time for it to be called out and for people to stand firmly with Jews. Mertz pointed out Israel's been doing all our dirty work. And it's absolutely fine to be critical of Netanyahu, critical of different Israeli policies. I've got no problem with that. And I've got no problem with free speech whatsoever, however much I might find what people are saying disgusting. What I find more troubling is that there's not enough people willing to stand up and be counted on this issue. And when it comes to the police, we only have to look at the banning of Maccabi fans at Villa Park in Birmingham by the police, who completely distorted their use of the Dutch police reports about earlier incidents with Maccabi fans back in the Netherlands when they themselves were chased. One Maccabi fan was thrown into the canal, right, as a deliberate attack. Again, a pogrom. We have to call it what it is.
Yeah. And more broadly, Pieter, I like what you said about there's a kind of atmosphere of anti-Westernism taking root. Yeah. Sometimes call it kind of a new third worldism or something similar. This you see more broadly. Last week on the podcast, we talked about this kind of bizarre attack on the nativity scene here in Brussels in the Grand Place. But broadly, in so many different areas, you see this like brewing anti-Westernism taking hold.
Yeah, absolutely. And you could argue the Palestinian flag is their flag. It shouldn't be. It should be the Palestinian flag, but it has been adopted, embraced by the anti-Western movement, and the sort of the nativity scene on the Brussels Grand Place is actually a good example, because this was signed off by the Brussels church authorities. Now, within the church, you have many people that sort of have embraced all of this anti-Westernism. They're not communists, but they're sort of, sympathizing with these kind of ideologies that indeed go against our history, are ultimately about, violating property rights, ultimately about going against family values that form the bedrock of civilization. Free speech, they're not very happy with it.
Yeah, well, that point about the bedrock of civilization, I think, is really important. There have been some useful things happen this year, which we might not have time to go. I mean, like that I was a big supporter of Slovakia, for example, amending its constitution to say, in an attempt to be in direct competition or violation with the EU, a kind of marker to say we're not going to accept any more of these so-called EU values, and we're going to stand up for family values, even if you don't have to defend everything that the Slovakian government does. But that, I thought, was a positive step. But more broadly, Tony, and this was something we really tried to address in our conference, Battle for the Soul of Europe, which lots of our speeches are going to be going out over the next few weeks, and there'll already be a few there by the time people watch this. But this was something we wanted to address, this sense that there's a continent in crisis, fundamental intellectual crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was very interesting. We had Václav Klaus speak on this session, and he's a fantastic speaker, and he made some great points. And he had a problem, Jacob, you might remember, with the title of our conference. And he said to me when he accepted the invitation to speak, he said, "Tony, what's all this talk about soul of Europe? What stuff and nonsense?" But the reality is that he would concede, and did concede, that there are important shared roots across European countries in terms of Judeo-Christian culture and heritage, in terms of, most importantly, things like religious tolerance, and then the fight for free speech. And Klaus was actually, the one thing he said, which I thought was really excellent, was that the thing that does unite European nations is that fight for freedom and national democracy and the free speech that goes with it. So I do think that for me, the conference was a great opportunity to get people thinking about in a more serious, intelligent way, and debating different points of view about how we fight for the Europe that we want, and something that's rooted in the past but forward-looking.
Yeah, well, Pieter, I can't resist by ending to ask you then, for next year, we're going to reclaim some of these civilizational European values, and which I think are actually European as well. And America has a good claim to some of them, that they were tried and invented first here, so we should be more proud of them. What are you going to do? What are you going to argue for? What's going to be your kind of big thing you're going to take forward for 2026?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that is very important. When you're talking about EU policy, which is my area of focus, I think we need to scrap the climate taxation scheme, ETS, because at this moment it's killing our chemical industry. I just saw the new statistics that were out, and still the sort of the taxation of carbon in the gas price is twice as big as the total American gas price, and the European gas price is 4 times, almost 5 times as big as the American gas price. That's all what you need to know. We're committing economic suicide at the moment. So few people are talking about it, surprisingly. There's large-scale divestment in the chemical industry in Europe, and we need a chemical industry. We need cheap energy. And apart from all the other measures that take a lot of time, this is one thing that we can politically decide in one day, to scrap the ETS, which does not exist in America.
Yeah, well, the legacy of, I mean, this is the continent of the Industrial Revolution. This is the huge part of our legacy as well, I think. And so fighting these environmentalist laws, which basically say that human activity is a problem, that's got to be something we take forward for 2026. Tony, what are we going to take forward?
Well, for me, for 2026, the biggest thing is to encourage people to find their voice, to use their voice, and to be brave. I mean, that's, for me, the game changer. More that people do that, the tide of change becomes irresistible. The tide of change in favour of free speech, in favour of national democracy over technocratic, supranational approach. Find your voice. That's the big thing for me.
Well, thank you very much to the both of you. I'm going to use this opportunity to thank our viewers for sticking with us across what's been a really exciting year. Our audience has grown a lot. We've almost doubled our subscribers on YouTube over the course of the year, which we're really delighted about. But that's because you've helped us get the word out. We mention every week on the podcast that the level of algorithmic interference that the big platforms like YouTube are subject to, often by the EU, makes it harder and harder to get an alternative to the mainstream establishment takeout. But thanks to the hard work of all of you guys watching, listening, commenting, and sharing this podcast and our other videos, that we managed to put out a bit of an alternative. So thank you, and thank you to Tony for coming on.
Delighted.
Thanks, Pieter, for joining us once again.
It's my pleasure, and Merry Christmas.
Yeah, and there's all that's left to say is Merry Christmas and have a wonderful New Year.